Welcome to the Institute for Future Studies. It's time for our regular research seminar, and today we have one of our own, actually. It's Katharina Berndt Rasmussen, who's going to talk to us about bridging divides, a theory of discrimination. Katharina is a researcher in practical philosophy here at the Institute and an associate senior lecturer at the Department of Philosophy at Stockholm University. You got your PhD in 2013, and the dissertation was on democracy and the common good. And that was actually awarded a prize for the best dissertation in the humanities that year. And your main supervisor was someone called Gustav Arrhenius, who is the director of the Institute, and the second supervisor, Folke Teschmann, also known here. So your area of specialization revolved around the topics of discrimination, sexism, racism, implicit bias, social norms, and democracy. I should also add that you're an editor for the Tidskrift for Political Philosophy, a Swedish academic publication in political philosophy. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Christer, for this introduction, and thank you all for coming. Really happy to see you here and online. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've been working on the topic of discrimination for quite some time, and I'm now in the process of putting things together in a book with the very tentative title Bridging Divides, as in the sense of building bridges across divisions, a theory of discrimination. Okay, so this talk basically summarizes the core ideas of this theory and also applies them to some current social and political issues. So I'm interested in discrimination in part because this concept brings together different fields within philosophy. I mean, obviously it's a relevant concept in moral and political philosophy, but it also connects to epistemology, connects to philosophy of language, to social ontology, just to mention some. And one could say that this concept also bridges disciplinary divides by connecting with the social science. Lots of different social scientists who are interested in discrimination. As of course, discrimination is a highly relevant concept for our social world. And this is mirrored in public debate. And there has been a lot of debate about discrimination going on. I will start this talk by giving some examples from the Swedish debate, Swedish public debate and media. And this concept has given rise to a lot of disagreement and also to genuinely hard questions about discrimination. So I will exemplify some of these hard questions once we get going here. So take this first headline. Earlier this year, Swedish national television featured the headline, "Watch the debate about the new EU directive on gender quotas, quote, no, no, and no," end quote. So this was a debate where EU Parliament candidate Alice Teodorescu proposed or opposed the EU directive on gender quotas for corporate boards, specifying that at least 40% of the board members should be women. And Teodorescu opposed this as discrimination. Her rival candidate Alice Bah Kuhnke disagreed. But of course then the question is it discriminating to mandate gender quotas for boards of directors in the economic sector? Is, more generally speaking, affirmative action discrimination? Is it wrongful discrimination? These are questions that are not easily settled. Okay, take the next headline. It reads, "Give those who are subjected to ethnic profiling by the police the opportunity for redress." Now this article concerns a new law on inspection zones, visitationszoner in Swedish, which does give the police a right to stop and search people, even without specific suspicion of criminal behavior, within temporary designated areas. This has given rise to a lot of debate. And here the discrimination ombudsman called this new practice ethnic profiling and argued that anti-discrimination law, which does not cover this, these activities by the police, these measures, so he argued that anti-discrimination law should be expanded to protect minorities from such police measures. Now, I think it's not immediately clear whether such inspection zones or ethnic profiling in general really constitute wrongful discrimination. Why should we think that? Another hard question. The next headline is about a different thing. It's on the so-called Aurora case, and it reads, "The climate crisis affects young people. The state turns a blind eye." So this is a news article about a youth organization in Sweden who is suing the state on account of failure to take appropriate climate measures. And actually the Swedish Supreme Court just recently approved that they may take their case against the state to the courts. So this is pending. And there have been other such cases. There's a recent verdict against the state of Switzerland by the European Court of Justice, who found the failure of taking adequate climate measures to be in violation of the state's legal obligation not to violate human rights. Often these kinds of legal cases are framed in terms of human rights. But I think an interesting question to ponder is, could these cases be reframed as discrimination cases? So as disadvantageous treatment of future generations by the present generation? If so, maybe we should look into applying discrimination law to these cases. But this is not done. Why should we do this, or why not? Okay. There's another headline coming up. This is from the Swedish Parliament website. So in recent times, the Sweden Democrats, far-right Swedish party, Parliament party, they have been quite active in putting discrimination on the agenda. So here one member brought claims of rising Swedophobia, so an aversion towards Swedes. So he brought these claims to the Swedish Parliament and asked whether the government intends to acknowledge Swedophobia and to provide countermeasures. So again, this is a genuine question. What should we make of claims alleging Swedophobia, also known as reverse discrimination? And maybe more generally still, which groups should be protected by prohibitions of discrimination, and why? We need to get our answers straight on these questions. So for another suggestion by the Sweden Democrats regarding the grounds of discrimination, here's a further headline. It's from a few years back, but the party has been repeatedly addressing this specific question in the Swedish Parliament. So the headline reads, "Sweden Democrats voted on political discrimination." And then the text goes on, "The Sweden Democrats voted on a proposal in their internal congregation to make political discrimination a recognized ground for discrimination under the law. The party leadership's position won, though, and it seeks to remove all grounds for discrimination." So there's some debate within this party on whether to include more grounds under discrimination law or just to get rid of discrimination law altogether. So let's stay with the first sentence here about adding the ground of political discrimination. Members of the party have repeatedly referred to the UN Conventions on Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights and their inclusion of political views or political convictions as a ground of discrimination. And hence they have been calling for Swedish discrimination law to include this ground as well. But once again, on what grounds should we decide whether to include political conviction in the protected grounds of discrimination? This is a question we need to address. And the thing is that discrimination law itself cannot answer these questions. So the law can tell us which actions or policies are currently legally prohibited, but not why, on which grounds they are problematic, and thus reasonably prohibited, right? And then, of course, if we turn to the second sentence here, claiming that the Sweden Democrats now want to get rid of discrimination law altogether. The law cannot tell us why we should have discrimination law in the first place. So, once again, genuine question, do we really need special rules and regulations and laws against discrimination? Now, 2 years ago, the then newly appointed chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Justice, Richard Jomshof, proposed in accordance with party line that we should abolish discrimination law altogether. And that is, abolish the special protection of certain groups due to specific grounds of, as they are in Sweden, sex, transgender identity or expression, ethnicity, religion or other belief, disability, sexual orientation, or age. So abolish that kind of special protection is the suggestion. And to replace discrimination law with a general law against any undue differential treatment. Now, in an op-ed, I disagreed. The headline says it's problematic to abolish discrimination law. But why this is so still deserves some justification, right? So I'm going to get into this. So in order to address all these disagreements and answer all these questions in a principled and coherent manner, we do need a theory of discrimination. And so in the first part of this talk, I propose such a theory of discrimination, which aims to capture our intuitions, people's intuitions, about more clear-cut cases of discrimination. So I will outline a concept of discrimination and its relation to moral wrongness and to social injustice. And then in the second part of the talk, I will explore how this theory answers the above questions, what it can say about the cases that I introduced. And I hope to show that a deeper understanding of our concept of discrimination, our concerns about discrimination, can improve our judgments of such cases. All right. So, now to the conceptual question. What is discrimination, then? What do we mean when we use this term, when we say this is discrimination? Well, of course, it depends. Discrimination can mean many different things in many different contexts. Some of these things are clearly not of interest in the context of my initial questions. For instance, that we can discriminate between different colors. That's not the relevant concept. Color discrimination in the kind of color spectrum context. But then what is the relevant concept of discrimination? So, as you can guess, I'm most interested in capturing social phenomena, and more precisely, phenomena that are called out by claims like this. But this is discrimination, with a frown. These are claims that call for a reaction, right? So at least a frown indicating social non-desirability. But also, and maybe more importantly, a moral condemnation, moral blame maybe even. This is bad, this is wrong. you should be ashamed of yourself, or maybe you should be shamed by others. Of course, in the legal context, such claim then may also imply that this is against the law, so you should be legally punished. But I will here in this talk not be concerned with the law, but with the conceptual questions and the moral questions. So again, what is discrimination in this relevant sense? And when and why is it morally wrong? And when I say morally wrong, I mean in the sense of that classifying an action or policy as discrimination would give us at least some reason that speaks against this action or policy. So to get started, consider this clear-cut paradigmatic example. This is discrimination. Now this is the case of racist recruitment discrimination, as can easily be seen. It calls for only born US citizens white applicants, though it says this information shouldn't be shared with the candidates. So this is an actual job advertisement on a recruitment website in March 2023. Of course, this is an accident at work, but still, it's telling. This hiring policy, as specified here, looking for white candidates, is clearly discriminating against any non-white applicant. Just because of their race or skin color, they don't even get a chance at this job. So they are subjected to worse treatment than they would have been had they been white. And what's morally problematic here is maybe also quite obvious. While these non-white candidates lose out on a benefit or the chance to a benefit, but I think there's something more. There's also something problematic with the message this conveys to non-white applicants and others involved. Let me consider this with all the information in place. All right, we will start with the definitions. So here's a definition that is tailored to capture such a paradigmatic case. This is a definition that is quite close to one of the most influential definitions in the field by Katharina Berndt Rasmussen, but I've tweaked it a bit, so this is then my definition, and it has 4 conditions. So it says an agent group discriminates against a victim by doing an action A in a context C, if and only if 1, there's a property P, such that the victim has this property. We'll get to what that property can be. 2, by doing action A, agent treats victim worse than agent would have treated them had they, the victim, not had this property P. 3, it is because victim has this property P that agent treats them worse by doing A. And finally, importantly, 4, P is the property of being a member of a socially salient group in this context C. Now, all of this needs to be filled in and explained, and I will get to that. First of all, one might want to know what is a socially salient group. So here's a also very influential definition or explication in the field, also by Katharina Berndt Rasmussen. A socially salient group is a group perceived membership of which is important to the structure of social interactions across a wide range of social contexts. So social salience is socially relevant for the kinds of interactions we have, and that kind of in very many different contexts. I will also get back to this explication, talk more about it later. But of course, I mean, standard groups that are socially salient group in our societies are different racial groups, it's race, sex, or gender, sexual orientation, disability, age, and the basically grounds of discrimination that I mentioned initially. So these would fit this explication, this characterization. Now I'm not entirely happy with this definition. I also want to allow for victim just being believed to have this property P by the agent. So the agent might be mistaken and discriminate against someone even though they don't have this property, but the agent mistakenly believes that they do. So I will add them here to this definition, but I will not focus on them. So I'll just take them all in. So it would also be discrimination if the agent believes that this victim has the property P, and by doing A, agent treats victim worse than agent would have treated them had agent not believed victim to have this property P. And it is because agent believes that victim has P that agent treats them worse by doing A. But since I won't focus on these, I will just leave them in the background. Now looking at this definition, there are, well, at least two conditions that can be given at least two different interpretations. And I want to focus on those. That's 2 and 3. So let's look at condition 2, treating worse. That might be interpreted as differential treatment. So treating white and non-white people differently, as in the racial discrimination and recruitment case. But treating worse might also mean treating everybody the same on a facially neutral policy, one might say, where this same treatment has disparate impact for different groups. So treating everybody the same where this is worse, say, for non-white people. So we have differential treatment, disparate impact on this condition, depending on interpretation. And then we have the because clause here, 3. That might be interpreted as that the fact that victim has this property P is part of agent's motivating reasons or intentions. So for instance, the agent has racist prejudice or aversions and is motivated by these. But the because clause, show it to you, here it is. The because clause can also be interpreted in the kind of opposite way, so where this fact that victim has P is not part of the agent's motivating reasons or intentions. So where the treatment is due to the fact that victim has this property P, but this property itself doesn't figure in the agent's intentions. So it's in that sense non-intentional treatment. And I will give you some examples of these two distinctions just in a minute. But first I want to bring your attention to that with this differential treatment, disparate impact distinction and the intentional non-intentional distinction, we have in combination 4 forms of discrimination. Can combine them, right, in this way. And so among these 4 forms of discrimination, it is common to refer to specifically 2 forms of discrimination, namely direct and indirect discrimination. So here's a paradigmatic case of direct discrimination as differential intentional treatment, intentional differential treatment. So it reads, a university in the early 1950s, US South, accepts a white applicant but turns down an equally qualified black applicant, stating, this is a whites-only university. Black applicants are referred to apply to some separate but equal university for African Americans. Clearly intentional and differential treatment of black and white applicants. By the way, I use race and race terms here in a strictly social constructivist sense, so I'm not implying that there's any biological grounds to talking about races. So just to have that said, but it's useful to use these race terms as socially constructed to describe the discrimination that we observe surrounding us. All right. Here we have a paradigmatic case of indirect discrimination. It reads, an employer turns down a qualified black applicant, so somebody who is actually qualified to do the job, stating, we don't hire people who lack high school education, without any awareness of the criterions, ability to track politically induced and race-correlated educational deficits. So this would then be non-intentional treatment with the same treatment in a sense with disparate impact for different groups. And this is usually referred to as indirect discrimination. But as my two distinctions suggests, this is not the only forms of discrimination we should consider. So clearly we can imagine a case like the last one here, where this criterion is used intentionally. So an employer turns down a qualified black applicant stating, we don't hire people who lack high school education, while intentionally using this criterion because of its ability to track politically induced race-correlated educational deficits. So it is same treatment for all, the same criterion applies to all, but it does have a disparate impact in this social context, social and political context, and it is intentional. And also, you might imagine a case where people are treated differently due to one of the grounds of discrimination, but in a non-intentional manner. And the key word here is implicit bias, for instance. So a university accepts a white PhD candidate but turns down an equally qualified black PhD candidate, stating that the latter was less qualified, where this unequitable ranking then is due to the evaluator's implicit racial biases, maybe something they aren't even aware of that they have, but it still kind of colors their assessment of the candidates, and it's non-intentional in this sense. Okay, so now we have a grip on some of the concepts, on the concept and the conceptual map for some of its different forms. And I will now turn to the question why these phenomena it picks out would be morally wrong. So there are in the literature different theories, and I will sketch some of them very briefly. So when and why is discrimination wrong? Well, one family of accounts we might classify as agent-focused accounts. And there are quite a few proponents in the literature. So here's Larry Alexander. Discrimination is wrong when and because it is premised on the belief that some types of people are morally worthier than others. Now, Alexander actually later changed his mind and contended or said that we actually have no idea why discrimination is wrong, but at least he has given expression to this view. Another person who has discussed that view is Richard Arneson. Discrimination is wrong when and because it is done from unwarranted animus or prejudice against persons of a certain socially salient, we might say, type. So discussing, actually, Alexander Arneson describes this view. And of course, just recently we had Garrett Cullity here with us, presenting on discrimination and stating that the agent's attitudes can make discriminatory action impermissible is not merely a peripheral phenomenon, but takes us to the heart of what makes discrimination wrong. So this is an unpublished paper by Garrett Cullity and Daniel Wodak. And, well, finally, Andrew Altman, in his influential entry on discrimination in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, even claims there is general agreement that wrong concerns the kind of reason or motive that guides the action of the agent of discrimination. The agent is acting on a reason or motive that is in some way illegitimate or morally tainted. Now, I don't agree. I find these accounts problematic. First, we could think of all kinds of cases in which the disadvantageous treatment is based on social group membership, but not due to any aversions. Maybe somebody doesn't hire a black candidate because they know that all the clients the candidate will deal with are racist, and so it wouldn't be good for business. No aversion there, but we would still want to say that this is wrongful discrimination. There might also be cases where someone acts from prejudice, but like always gets things terribly wrong, so actually always benefits the intended targets of the discrimination, which doesn't turn out to be discrimination then, maybe. So this has kind of these types of problems, but more importantly, I think it has the wrong focus, right? So the focus here is on the agent's motives, their beliefs and attitudes. And I mean, of course, well, it's often quite difficult to know what goes on in people's heads, and they might not be honest about it and so on. But that's not the big problem here. It's kind of looking in the wrong direction. What is problematic about discrimination, I claim, is what it does to the individuals it affects and to the social surroundings they're in. We shouldn't look at the agent so much as to what the action means and what it does to the victims. I might add that I think that, well, one might say that, well, intentions seem to matter, because people quite often, think about this stuff when it comes to discrimination. What did the agent really intend here? So intuitively, it does seem to matter to many people, and I think I can absolutely acknowledge that they have some relevance, but I think they only have indirect relevance. So they help us assess what the agent would have done otherwise. So they help us assess whether this is discrimination by giving us some information what would have happened had the agent not had this property P. But then, of course, they have an epistemic relevance and not a moral relevance. So that's my stance on this. Anyway, there are other accounts, and we can group them as victim-focused accounts. So one of the proponents is Katharina Berndt Rasmussen, who states an instance of discrimination is wrong when it is because it makes people worse off. They're worse off given the presence of discrimination than they would have been in some suitable alternative situation in which the relevant instance of discrimination had not taken place. Also here, Richard Arneson, more discussing his own view, says that acts of discrimination are morally wrong only if harmful. So he states this as a necessary but not sufficient condition, so indicating that we can of course have pluralist accounts, using several of these accounts and putting them together. There can also be non-harm accounts, which are victim-focused. So for instance, Sophia Moreau has this account that, or discusses this account, that wrongful discrimination involves disadvantaging certain individuals because they possess, or are believed to possess, a certain kind of characteristic in circumstances where this disadvantage is unfair, namely when a person is deprived of those freedoms to which they are entitled. So clearly victim-focused, but focused on the freedoms rather than the harm. Moreau is one of the authors who does embrace a pluralist account in her latest book, which I won't go into, but clearly pluralist accounts are possible, and I myself am in a sense a pluralist, as I will tell you in a minute. Then there are also accounts that are action-focused, right? So they focus on the action, what it expresses, what it means. And a very prominent defender here is Deborah Hellman, who says an action or policy wrongfully discriminates when it is demeaning. That is, when it expresses that a person or group is of lower status, where the actor of or institution expressing this meaning must have sufficient social power for this expression to have force. Such is what it means for kind of the social context, the meaning of inferiority that makes discrimination wrong. And Patrick Shin has a similar account when it action or policy wrongfully discriminates when it expresses unequal respect for the moral status of an individual under some differentiating description compared to the respect reserved to some class of individuals who are not picked out by that description. So, very complicated way of saying social salience. So what makes discrimination wrong is the social meaning of the action. So it's kind of an action in context focused account. And it picks up on how we relate to each other, right? So it's focusing on not merely the agent or the victim, but kind of their interpersonal relationship that's kind of conveyed through the action. And that seems to me to be relevant too, just like the previous harm accounts. So saying that I think this is plausible and also the harm account, some version of that is plausible, makes me agree with Thomas Scanlon, who has also kind of embraced a pluralist account of the wrongness of discrimination. And I want to bring out how these two concerns, harm and social meaning, demeaningness, inferiority, fit with my proposed definition. Now, I'm looking for the wrong-making feature of discrimination and how that connects to how I have defined discrimination. First of all, you might note that this definition does not mention the agent's intentions. And that's, of course, choice of design, because I don't think the intentions are directly morally relevant, so I don't concern myself with these, even in the definition. But then we can note that one of the conditions, 2, turns on victim being made worse off than they would have been in relevantly different circumstances. And this aligns with a standard analysis of harm, counterfactual analysis of harm. So here we can easily connect the definition to harm accounts of the wrongness of discrimination. But we can also interpret worse treatment as being treated as inferior. So we can also connect this definition to, for instance, Deborah Hellman's account of the wrongness of discrimination in terms of demeaning treatment, what the action expresses. So both accounts can be kind of latched onto this definition, and thereby we can add a wrongness account to this definition. So here interpreted, agent treats victim worse as agent makes victim worse off, or treats victim as inferior compared to how victim would have fared without P. And so the wrongness account then says that discrimination is wrong because it harms or demeans victim. So note now that discrimination, according to this definition and with this wrongness account, is always wrong. So as soon as we classify an action as discrimination, given that we have this theory that includes the wrongness account, then that will automatically also be wrongful, morally speaking. So that means that classifying an action or policy as discrimination will then give us some reason that speaks against this action or policy, just like I set out to, include in my theory. Of course, we can allow that this reason against this action then might be outweighed by other considerations. We can also allow that discriminating agents may be exculpated, so maybe they're not blameworthy after all. So this is not the final word on discrimination, but it captures the sense that when something is classified as discrimination, there is some attached reason conveyed that don't do it, right? So this is in line with my goal of capturing kind of the worrisome variance of this social phenomenon. But I think that the normative analysis here doesn't really go far enough. So here, with this wrongness account, discrimination is morally on a par with other kind of random actions that harm or demean someone. But it seems that there is something particularly devious, pernicious with discrimination. And that has to do with it being tied to social group membership, so being tied to a broader social structure or pattern. And some philosophers have picked up on this worry, discrimination, so they provide us with kind of, let's say, pattern-focused accounts, social pattern-focused accounts, where the wrongness is taken to arise from the manner in which the act is embedded within a broader social pattern of inequality. So proponents here are Mana Haidin, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. An act of discrimination is wrong when because it is part of a pattern of acts that have significant, morally undesirable, cumulative effects. Kind of takes us in that direction. And Paul Woodruff, I suggest that an act of discrimination is wrong when it is wrong, not simply because it is discriminatory, but because it is part of a pattern of discrimination that is wrong. He also says, slavery, poverty, and the like are born by individuals. Discrimination is born by groups. So there's this social, structural dimension to discrimination. And I want my definition to be able to capture the relevant things in order to also say that there's something normatively concerning with that dimension. Now, I think quite easily we can find a social or structural, or whatever we want to call it, dimension in my definition, just looking at the last condition and the social salience condition, right? So I said I would get back to that, and now I do. So as I said, social salience is quite often then defined as group membership that is important to the structure of social interactions across a wide range of social contexts. But why is harming and demeaning specifically directed towards socially salient groups so pernicious, one might still ask? What's so special about social salience? I think the deeper concern here is with social patterns of systematic social disadvantages that are unjustified. And so I propose another explication of social salience, which is not in direct conflict with the previous one, but it's a bit more precise. And it's a bit more normatively informative. And it says a socially salient group is a group which is subject to systematic, unjustified social disadvantages. And there is another term for systematic unjustified social disadvantages, and that's social injustice. So we can plug in here a theory of social justice or injustice that helps us single out the relevant disadvantages and distributive patterns, and thereby provides us with a criterion for the normative assessment that discrimination is not just wronging individuals, but it's also socially unjust. So the injustice account that I want to add is discrimination is unjust because it reproduces and exacerbates systematic unjustified social disadvantages. Now in this sense, I think discrimination is kind of a bridge concept between criteria of moral wrongness and of social injustice or justice, between individualist and structural analyses of harm and inequalities, if you will, between the personal and the political. And that's what I think makes this concept distinctive and also distinctively useful, both within philosophy and more broadly in society. I think this allows us to make sense of the special normative oomph, the normative force of the complaint. But this is discrimination. It has this dual normative component. Right. So, going back to the initial questions. I hope I have 5 more minutes, if that's okay. Yeah, thanks. The first question was, is affirmative action wrongful discrimination? Well, one might now answer that if the people left out by affirmative action programs, in some context, are the people who are not subject to systematic, unjustified social disadvantages within this context, well then they wouldn't qualify as a socially salient group on my account. And this allows us to say that the standard cases of affirmative action then are not even discrimination to begin with. Right? Are you with me? So, since affirmative action usually kind of benefits disadvantaged groups, which means it's kind of not benefiting advantaged groups, the advantaged groups have no claim to discrimination because they are not a socially salient group in my definition of social salience. And I think this gives us kind of the right answer to these cases, but it also gives us a principled justification of why we should say, no, affirmative action is not wrongful discrimination. Okay, next case. Are police measures such as racial or ethnic profiling discriminating? Well, so once again, if the likely individual targets of such measures belong to socially salient groups in my sense, and if these measures potentially harm or demean these individual members because of their racial, ethnic, socially salient features, and also if these measures potentially reproduce and exacerbate systematic unjustified social disadvantages, then yes, this would be wrongful and unjust discrimination. There might be other reasons to consider, other considerations. But just taken on its own, this would then be wrongful and unjust discrimination, according to my theory. All right. Can we discriminate against future generations, for instance, by failing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Could these cases, these court cases, be reframed as discrimination cases, so as disadvantageous treatment of future generations by the present generation? Well, this is kind of the case I'm least sure of. But there are problems of claiming that future generations are harmed by our choices, and these have to do with the philosophical non-identity problem. They wouldn't even exist hadn't we taken these kind of bad choices. So they have no ground to complain. And also there are problems with saying that these choices would be demeaning towards them, because I think there needs to be some kind of shared social context within which acts are ascribed meaning. And we don't have this shared social context with generations like far in the future. So I think it's problematic on these accounts. It surely is unjust. We can talk about injustice in these cases, but I would not say that it amounts to discrimination for these reasons. But as I said, I'm not entirely sure of this. Next, is there such a thing as reverse discrimination or Swedophobic discrimination? Well, no, I would say, not in Swedish society as it looks today. Swedes as such generally are not subject to systemic unjustified social disadvantages within this social context. And then once again, they're not a socially salient group, and then there is no discrimination to begin with. However, the Sweden Democrats are right here about that we should regularly reconsider which groups should be protected by prohibitions of discrimination. We should discuss these questions. But of course, answering these questions should then be informed by empirical findings concerning these systematic social disadvantages that permeate our society. And then we can kind of consider, should we kind of, consider other groups as being on the disadvantaged side of these patterns. It's a discussion to be had, but I think when it comes to being Swedish, the answer is still no. And this kind of last remark here also reminds us of the importance of equality data, right? So we need data on how different groups fare in our society in order to be able to take a stance on which groups should be protected by discrimination law. Last, could the law against undue differential treatment that is proposed by the Sweden Democrats replace discrimination law? That is, could we just have a law against differential treatment on irrelevant grounds, undue irrelevant grounds? Well, the thing here is that we still would need to know what counts as an irrelevant or undue ground. So we would need a criterion for that, or we would need a list of normatively relevant items, as is given by the existing grounds of discrimination, of course. And this is, as, for instance, Lena Haldenius has argued, that we can't just say that this is a neutral, kind of clinically neutral, way of framing kind of differential treatment law. We still need to engage with the normative hard questions in order to take a stance on what is irrelevant, what is undue. treatment. So that doesn't really solve the question, and also it's not really clear how this suggestion even would capture cases of disparate impact. So where there's no differential treatment, but same treatment with disparate impact. So in sum, I think, yes, we do need a law against discrimination based on specific grounds, which can be renegotiated, in order to capture the distinctive social phenomenon that is pernicious for individual well-being, for social relations of equality, and for any society striving for social justice. Thank you.
Okay, it's time now for a Q&A session, and I should tell you that the first half an hour of this will be actually recorded, and we'll use the chat function to run the Q&A for you online. So if you wish to ask a question, you should write that in the chat, and it would be good if you put your name and your subject, because we're from different fields here. You can also do a follow-up by writing follow-up, and then the name of the person you want to follow up to. And of course, we have a finger convention here in the seminar. Yeah. So, Olle?
Okay, thank you, Katharina. Thanks for a very good presentation. I think that my question is a question of clarification. On your account, all discrimination is wrong, right? In virtue of the making worse condition that
Yes.
comes with this normative.
Yes. So may I just say, on my theory of discrimination, it is always wrong, given the definition and the wrongness account, right? So they have to be in place.
Okay. But when you quoted the other authors in the discussion of what is it that makes discrimination wrong, it seemed to me that they're all providing an account of when discrimination is wrong, meaning that their conceptual account of discrimination cannot agree with yours. It must be that they don't think that discrimination is always wrong, right? Otherwise they wouldn't have this additional. So this means that your account, what does it give us that these other people's authors' account doesn't give us? They're giving this purely non-moral account of discrimination first, and then this add-on normative account of when it's wrong. So I was just unclear of exactly what your account gives in comparison to theirs.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Good question. So, I mean, as I said when I interrupted you, so the definition is morally neutral in the sense that it doesn't make any kind of normative. I mean, it doesn't make any kind of upfront moral claims about discrimination. The theory is not normatively neutral or morally neutral, since the theory also includes this wrongness account. This wrongness account connects quite well to one of the conditions. And then when it comes to how this is framed in the literature, I mean, for one thing, people are maybe driven by different kind of goals. My goal is quite narrow from the beginning, right? I want to capture the problematic phenomena that we call discrimination, where we say, well, this is discrimination, there's something wrong with it. So I'm kind of aiming to capture this, and I'm very happy to just say that, this is then a definition of wrongful discrimination, where we kind of bake the moral account into the definition. So it's a morally wrongful discrimination that I'm interested in and defining. Whereas there might be other definitions that might kind of align with mine or might be different concerning other phenomena. But I'm not interested in those, so why bother? So basically, this also goes back to, when I talk to lay people, philosophically speaking, and I say, I have read this book, When is Discrimination Wrong? They often look at me like, what do you mean, when? It's always wrong, right? And so I think, there's something to the idea of kind of not being so concerned with, other things than the morally problematic and injustice-wise problematic phenomena.
Thanks.
Okay, Tim? Next one.
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk. So I have a question about the importance of being a member of a socially salient group and the sort of work that it did in your explanations of or your answers to two questions. One, whether affirmative action is wrongful discrimination, and two, whether Swedophobic is a real thing. So in your answer to each of those questions, you said, I think, two things to explain why the answer to the first question, is affirmative action wrongful discrimination, is no, and also two things to support your answer to the question, is Swedophobic a real thing? No, right? The first was that in the case of, in both cases, we've got this distinction between groups, but the group who some people might think is being discriminated against it's not disadvantaged, hasn't had these the disadvantages of the other groups that we're interested in. I get that part, but I didn't get the second thing, which is that they're not socially salient groups. I didn't understand that. So I don't understand, for example, why Swedes can't be a socially salient group. Like your definition of socially salient group is just a group perceived membership of which is important to the structure of social interactions across a wide range of contexts. And I thought, like, being a Swede, like Swedes could be a socially salient group. Or in the case of affirmative action, I guess it depends on how the groups are distinguished. I guess if you have a specific group, let's say black people, and the other group you're comparing them to is just non-blacks, right? Maybe that group is not socially salient, but it seems to me that you could have a case where the alternative group is just defined. Maybe it's like just all whites or all, something like that. And I wouldn't understand why that wouldn't be a socially salient group. So it seemed to me that the first of the two reasons you gave in each case, those were doing work in supporting your answer, but I didn't see how the second reason, that these are not socially salient groups, I didn't see the work that was doing.
Right, okay, thank you. So this was going a bit fast, I guess. So my idea here is to actually replace this social salience expectation of being a member of a group, perceived membership of which is and so on, replacing that with this one. A socially salient group is a group which is subject to systematic unjustified social disadvantages. So you're absolutely right that on the former characterization, Swedes and like non-Swedes and like everybody would belong to a socially salient group, and there would be then discrimination going on in the case of affirmative action. I think there's something problematic with that, and I want to kind of accommodate this feeling, this thought, by looking closely at what is problematic with social salience in the first place. And it's not that there are different groups and there's like, the group memberships is important to the social interactions across different spheres. It is rather that what is problematic is that groups that are already disadvantaged by the kind of unjust structures that we have are then also so kind of adding insult or adding injustice to injury in a sense. So we have the injustice, but then they're also kind of treated worse, so it kind of exacerbates the already existing injustice. And that can be captured by focusing on the groups, the socially salient groups that are disadvantaged. So I'm kind of just...
Okay, I think I missed that redefinition of a social salient group just is a group that's been subject to systematic unjustified social disadvantages.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can kind of do this in two ways. You can do it as you did it, changing the definition of social salient group, or you could just, make that criterion explicit without changing the definition. You're doing it the first way. I see.
Okay, yeah. Sure, I mean that would have been, could have had an extra condition then maybe. One might also maybe want to handle it in a slightly different way and say that, well, we stick to the former social salience condition and just allow that this would be discrimination against Swedes or against majority members or whatever. But then we would add other considerations and say that's still problematic because of, you know, these kind of features of injustice that are exacerbated. But I think what makes discrimination kind of distinctive and important is that it has these two components. I want to kind of put them both into the definition of the phenomenon that I think we should be interested in, and that is especially problematic. I'm happy to allow that there are other definitions of discrimination in a broader sense, and according to which we might be able to say that, well, yeah, Swedes are discriminated against in a certain context, even though they are kind of the majority members who are not disadvantaged. So we might have some other concept of discrimination kind of acknowledging their kind of complaints. But I think that's not the interesting concept of discrimination. This is the one that's interesting. This is the one we should be worried about, and this is the one we should kind of try to counteract.
There's a follow-up from Julia.
Yes, thanks, Katharina. That was very interesting. Thank you for the talk. Very informative talk. So I also had a question about the definition of socially salient group. I was a bit confused about it. So first, my interpretation was like the same as Tim's, the idea that, well, it's just anyone who's salient for whatever reason, normative reason in society. And then I thought, okay, well, then these guys are going to be socially salient group too. But then, like, especially after what you said, now there seems to be something stronger, more normative behind it, beyond mere just like salience in that sense. So it would seem like social salience has to do with being part of a pattern of social injustice behavior, which to me sounds a little bit like saying that these are groups that may have already been discriminated against in the past. So if they've already disadvantaged, it seems like they may have already been, you know, subject to discriminatory practices. And so that makes me wonder whether that leads to a bit of a circularity in the definition, or sorry, not in the definition, in the account, the normative account that you're proposing. I'm not familiar with the literature, so I might be missing something here. So just if you had thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. So I want to capture you know, the importance of discrimination in a context where there is social injustice. And the social injustice might be distributive injustice, so resources being distributed evenly, opportunities, and so on and so forth. And of course, these distributions have come about in some way. And it's very plausible to think that there were actions that we would call discriminating on this account that were among the causes of the inequalities that we observe. However, the definition just presupposes that we assess the social context as is and just assess the inequalities that exist and look at which groups are the ones at the disadvantaged side and which we then have reason to give extra protection. So there's, well, it's not a circularity, I think, in the theory. I mean, there is, of course, some loops, feedback loops in the causal history of the inequalities. But I don't think that's a conceptual or normative worry here, because we can just, you know, I mean, the reason we care about these injustices and the disadvantaged groups, yeah, well, they have to do with our, well, that we care about justice, and it doesn't matter there how they were created, I would say.
Okay, next on the list is Stina.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you for this, Katharina. It was very interesting and clear. I have a question about the normative claim or the normative account. discrimination being wrong because it harms or demeans the victim. And I just wanted you to say a little bit more about how we're supposed to understand harming in this case. So I was just kind of thinking of, what if I apply for 2 jobs and one is at this place it's horrible workplace, the people there are really mean and stuff like that, and another place that's really nice, but I don't know this, like I think that they're equal, and then this really bad workplace discriminates against me because I'm a woman, for instance. And in this case, I would say that, like, suppose that if I had gotten that job, I would have agreed to it and I would have started there and I would have been miserable, right? Then I'm not made worse off in one sense, right? I'm not being harmed by this discriminatory practice. Rather, I'm being benefited by it in the kind of big picture. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how you understand harm in this case, or how you would understand this case on their account.
Mm. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for asking this question. I have a good answer. No, so I mean, that kind of case is one of the reasons why I think we cannot just settle for a harm account of the wrongness of discrimination, because there will be such cases where, just by fluke or whatever, people will be made better off by not getting the job that they applied for instance. And there are such cases in the literature on harm, where they make a lot of trouble. I think I don't have to import that trouble into the account, because then I can kind of fall back on the demeaning conditions. So basically the idea is then that still in not getting the job because you're a woman, that kind of refusal to hire you or refusal to consider your application on that ground is treating you as inferior. So it carries this kind of social meaning. And that makes the act morally wrong by this hybrid account. So it's kind of trying to catch all hybrid thing. I mean, as always in philosophy, you can probably construe cases where people are just by a fluke being made better off by not getting the job, and I don't know, nobody ever finds out about it. Hellman would have a reply to that and say that's just kind of the capacity of expressing inferiority that suffices, even if it in fact doesn't materialize as such. But I guess you could construct these kinds of cases, and I mean, then in those cases I would have to bite the bullet and say, well, then it's not discrimination. But those are not the usual cases that we should worry about. I'm sorry.
Can I follow up quickly? Yeah. So I thought you might answer by saying, like, appealing to this demeaning factor. I should just kind of report the impression that I had was that I'm a bit unclear about what it means for an act to be demeaning. So I just for kind of for I don't know for knowledge, I think it would be nice then to have a more kind of spelled out kind of, or not a full account, but maybe just say a little bit more about what a demeaning act is as well. Yeah, thanks.
There's another follow-up. Can you a short one? We've got a long list of.
Oh, mine wasn't a short.
Oh, sorry, it was a hand. Sorry, I thought it was okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Then we're actually going to go online, and there's someone called Gustav Arrhenius. Not sure who that is, but.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Katharina, for this very informative talk and great presentation. Just one question where I wondered how your definition works out, and that's when you have kind of different groups that fulfills your kind of salience condition. So assume that I'm the chief of police in an area with a lot of people, immigrant background, race white people, and I want to hire racified women because I know, have very good reason to think that will increase the efficiency, for example, when dealing with rape cases and similar things. So I wonder then, according to your theory, am I then morally wrongfully discriminating against racified men by excluding them in this ad? And the assumption, of course, I think this should be justified if you think you need this for having a more efficient police force to hire and go use for racified women. That's the main question I have. A small other question too, but that's the main question.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Also very, very good question. So this is, of course, kind of touching upon the very complicated issue of intersectionality in one sense. And I have been thinking a bit about the problem of intersectionality in the sense that there's this kind of a common complaint against discrimination, theorizing discrimination law, that it kind of looks at like one group membership at a time, and it can capture and deal with more complex interwoven group memberships of, for instance, racialized, lesbian, disabled women, and so on. So you can get these kind of very complex group memberships where discrimination theory has problems of dealing with these cases. I think I'm kind of hoping to further develop this social salience idea, the idea that socially salient groups are defined along the lines of the patterns that we discover in society, the lines of advantages and disadvantages. And I think we should be open to reconsider which groups are kind of the most disadvantaged along these lines, and that might actually help us to kind of reconfigure new group memberships that might kind of better trace also these intersectional lines. But I'm not there yet, so that's just a thought. Regarding the more specific question or the case that you posed, I mean, in one sense, you could say then that the woman, there are racialized applicants, and the woman, one woman applicant is hired and one male applicant or man applicant is not hired. And if we just kind of isolate the sex or gender feature, then we would say, well, in that sense, the man is not a disadvantaged member of a disadvantaged group. But I do realize that this is kind of flying in the face of research on intersectionality. So maybe that's...
But also, I thought you would say that, but let's say the grounds is not only that I want to have women, I also don't want to have... maybe I have some good reason to believe that it's also because it's just racified men will do a worse job here. Because there might be that female victims are not going to behave well when interviewed by them.
Okay, so that would be then a little bit different case.
There are two cases, so say. So it depends what I'm saying. Yeah.
Exactly. So I mean, in that case, I mean, if the person not getting the job belongs to a socially salient group, so we can kind of just assert that in some way. Or we can just kind of, justify that, explain that. Then, sorry, I lost my train of thoughts. So then I guess I would be happy to say that this person belonging to a disadvantaged group is discriminated against, so has a valid complaint in this case. But there are other considerations then, and those are the considerations that you have just alluded to, that there are some kind of requirements for being able to do the job well that unfortunately then mandate us to still kind of discriminate against this person for, the greater good, in a sense. But
okay, but then you would also accept that in the case of the car salesman that you need in let's say in your shop, you won't sell cars as well if you're racified, and that's why it's okay not to employ racified people because of the efficiency consideration.
Well, I think that's once again a different case, because then I mean, it's still then a socially salient group member is discriminated against. Yes, has a valid complaint, I would say. Then you would kind of allude to these considerations of kind of doing the job well. But since these then have to do with racist attitudes of the customers, then we of course would find a lot of moral fault in this kind of greater context. And we would say that all things considered, this rationale of hiring people to accommodate racist customers, that's not morally justified. Whereas in another case where we have we need a woman police officer to interview rape victims, for instance, because they wouldn't talk to a male police officer. That doesn't have the same kind of overall moral problems as the car salesman case. So I think there are, on that level, we can still differentiate between these two cases.
Okay. So we get morally wrongful discrimination, but it gets overridden by other considerations in this case.
But I think it's important that these other considerations, they do not take away that there is a valid complaint by the person not getting the job because of their already disadvantaged social group membership. That complaint is still there. It's just that we have to say, well, really sorry about that, but there are these other considerations, and they're actually weighing more in this context. But
It's not completely clear to me that there is, but intuitively, I'm not sure I feel the grip of that when it comes to hiring race-white women for a certain job in a certain area, but that these men, race-white men, have a complaint. But it doesn't seem completely intuitive, at least to me.
Oh, okay. So your first case was racial white women against black men?
No.
Okay,
It was race-white women that I want to hire as chief of police. Therefore, I'm discriminating against race-white men.
Okay, yeah. Good. Then everything I said counts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then it's Moa.
Thank you, Katharina, for a very interesting talk. I have a question that concerns... This? Okay, thank you. So I have a question that I think... I think, yeah, if I hold on to this microphone button, it's going to work now. Okay, so I have a question, I think, about the social salience of groups. And maybe I should say I'm a sociologist, to those of you who don't know that. So I think that my main concern with your account, I think, is that society is or social stratification is very complex, and it puts you sometimes in situations where things work out differently. So I was curious about the Swedish hostility case. So I'm going to give you an example of this incident that I witnessed many years ago when I was working in a school class, actually as a teacher of philosophy for children. And there were it was in a very segregated neighborhood. There were only 2 sort of visibly ethnic Swedish children in the school class. And they were being severely bullied. And they were bullied, and the other kids were using racial slurs in this bullying. And it was very hostile, both verbally and physically. So it was a very difficult situation for these 2 children, and they were like 10, 11 years old. And of course, they belonged to the ethnic majority in our society, but not in their school class and not in their neighborhood. And I mean, these kids are now, I think, probably 30 years old or something, 25 years old. But at that time, for many years, they were quite vulnerable. And would you then say that they were not being discriminated against? Just because, I mean, you have the general context, and then you have these very local contexts. Yeah. How would you treat that case? Would it just be mere bullying, or would it be relevant to call it ethnic bullying and harassment?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very good. Thanks for the case. Yes. So I think, my account has this social context clause in the definition, right? So it's kind of at the bottom, it is equipped to be adaptable to different social contexts. But then we would have to be very careful to also mention the context when we classify something, for instance, as discrimination, and say that in the context of the school, or maybe even in the context of this classroom, these students are disadvantaged in various ways, and then these kind of attacks and bullying and so on are just exacerbating this disadvantage. And then we could classify them as being discrimination in the context. So it's not, the context might be much more local. The problem then is, of course, that when you think about discrimination, you often think about law and what we should prohibit in law. And of course, then we're thinking about kind of, the national context. And so I think my account, being on the philosophical side of things, is a little bit more agile, so it can be kind of adapted to different settings, and we can make moral judgments in these settings and say that, in this classroom, this is morally wrong, this is also unjust, because we have this the structure of social of inequalities and injustice. While, like, if we look at the whole society and look at how the students fare in society as a whole, things might be different. But when it comes to the law, of course, it can't be that kind of nuanced and look at context in this very kind of agile way. So if we're not thinking about, you know, what we should prohibit as discrimination, because I've put that to one side, then I think the account has some resources to handle this. But it is a difficult case. I do agree with that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've reached the end, and I want to thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thanks for your comments. Thank you.
I also want to inform you about upcoming talks. On October the 23rd, we have Christian Rostböll, who will talk about why struggles for recognition can harm democracy on populism, respect and esteem. On November the 6th, we have our own Anna Tyllström, and she will give a talk entitled The Social Life of Elite Students, Early Socialization Tactics in Top Business Education. And November the 13th, we have Bo Rothstein, Should the Swedish Public Health Care be Nationalized? Consequences for Democracy, Legitimacy and Accountability. Thank you so much.